If you've been following me since 2017, you know I'm not a fan of American Civil War alternate histories. I find stories about the slavers winning their rebellion to be overdone, full of cliches, and often based on bad lost cause history. So as a general policy, I tend to avoid them on this channel, but sometimes that is impossible. There are some good alternate histories of that era that we do need to talk about, and perhaps set the record straight on. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and I'm here to talk about Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore, which is probably a foundational text of the alternate history genre, if I'm being honest. Bring the Jubilee is a 1953 time travel alternate history novel set in a dystopia where the so-called Confederacy won their independence after a victory at the Battle of Gettysburg and became a global superpower, while the rump United States sunk into an eternal depression. It was written by Ward Moore, aka Joseph Ward Moore, a Jewish-American science fiction writer who lived from 1903 to 1978. Bring the Jubilee has been republished about a dozen times since 1953. It will sometimes show up in collections of other classic alternate history stories. My personal copy of Bring the Jubilee is actually in The Best Alternate History Stories of the 20th Century, edited by Harry Turtledove with Martin H. Greenberg. And yeah, I personally believe Bring the Jubilee deserves that title, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. The novel is listed in David Pringle's science fiction The 100 Best Novels, an English language selection, 1949 to 1984. Counterfactual historian Gabriel Rosenfeld called it one of the best literary examples of alternate history. Multiple writers, including Phil K. Dick, author of The Man in the High Castle, credits Bring the Jubilee in inspiring them to write their own alternate histories. Stephen H. Silver, founder of the Sidewise Awards for Alternate History, even told me that the awards were almost named after the protagonist of Bring the Jubilee. I mean, there were other alternate histories that were published before Bring the Jubilee. Heck, Winston Churchill, of all people, published an alternate history about the South winning the Civil War before Ward Moore did. And yet, you can't really deny that Bring the Jubilee has had a major impact on the alternate history genre. And yet, despite all of this praise and recognition, there are a lot of people out there who criticize Bring the Jubilee, even going as far as to say it promotes a lost cause theory of the American Civil War. As in, the slavers' rebellion was not about slavery, and the traitors behind the so-called Confederacy were honorable and just men, yada yada yada. And while I want to dismiss this criticism, according to Rosenfeld, there were contemporary Southern reviewers who praised the novel because in their eyes it made an independent Confederacy look really great. But if proponents or opponents of the lost cause think Bring the Jubilee promotes that theory, then I think they are missing the point Moore was trying to make. But to understand what that point is, we need to look at what was written, who wrote it, when it was written, and, most importantly, why it was written. What was Moore saying to the reader? Also, spoiler alert for a decades-old alternate history, but as mentioned, Bring the Jubilee is set in an alternate timeline where the American Civil War is now called the War of Southern Independence, after Robert E. Lee's army was victorious at the Battle of Gettysburg, and, following the collapse of the Army of the Potomac, later went on to capture Washington, D.C. The war ends with the United States recognizing the independence of the Confederacy, ceding several states and territories to them, and being forced to pay indemnities, which permanently cripples their economy. By the 1950s, the rump United States is a backwards and poverty-stricken pariah. High unemployment and inflation are common. In fact, the country is so poor, this version of the U.S. never built a transcontinental railroad, in contrast to the Confederacy, which has built several. Things are so bad that many white Americans are either sharecroppers or ident themselves to corporations who keep them under contract until they are too old to work. Meanwhile, African Americans have few, if any, rights in the U.S. Those who haven't fled to Africa, Haiti, or the underpopulated western states face constant harassment or even death from white Americans who blame them and the abolitionists for their loss in the war. The United States population is also shrinking in part because people are having fewer, if any, children due to the economic hardships. Meanwhile, immigration is banned and many Americans are immigrating to places like Australia or the South African Republic. Politically, America is still under a two-party system, but the Democrats and Republicans have been replaced by the Whigs and the Populists. Whigs tend to be pro-CSA while maintaining the status quo. The Populists are more popular with the poor, but are even more radical when it comes to their views on foreigners and blacks. Crime is also rampant in both the cities and countryside due to the small and ineffective police and military. Thus, when foreign nationals are hurt or killed, or the United States tries to set up a tariff, it's not unusual for foreign militaries to retaliate against America since there is no one to stop them. As for the Confederacy, things are going well. After Lee became the second president in 1865, despite dying 5 years later in our timeline, his influence helped end slavery, but he was unable to prevent Southern, a term used to describe Confederates, expansion down south, as you can see from this map I commissioned from the always talented Sean McKnight. By the 1950s, the Confederacy extends all the way to Cape Horn, and this expansion helped turn the Confederacy into an industrialized superpower. which is great if you're a white male and had an ancestor who lived in the South before 1864, since citizenship is denied to former slaves, recent immigrants, and conquered Latin Americans. This doesn't stop people from moving to the Confederacy or leaving it, as their economic prosperity still remains relatively attractive. Funnily enough, the one Southern character we meet doesn't have a problem with this, partly because they grew up there and that's just normal to them, but I also think it has something to do with the fact that the United States treats blacks and immigrants so poorly that it makes the South seem more civilized in comparison, even though things are technically kind of awful down there. The Confederacy's only rival is the German Union, a nation formed by a merger between Prussia and Austria-Hungary. They won the Emperor's War, an alternate World War I that the Confederacy and the United States sat out of, which made them the only other superpower and drove the shaken British Empire into the Southern camp. The German Union's closest ally is Spain, who had a reversal of fortunes in the late 19th century of this timeline and now has a larger colonial empire. Regardless, these two camps are locked in a contest for control of the world that many predict will lead to a war worse than the Emperor's War and will in all likelihood be fought inside the United States. For some reason. More is vague on those details. The tech level of this alternate 1950s is pretty divergent from our own. Most of the technology is just slightly improved versions of late 19th century tech. In fact, it can almost be called steampunk. For example, in this timeline there are no internal combustion engines, light bulbs, telephones, or airplanes. When not using horses, the railroads, or steamships, people get around using steam-powered trackless locomotives called mini-biles, or sail-powered balloons. Even then, these machines are only common in the wealthiest nations, and in the United States you can only find them in major cities like New York. Telegraphs are still the primary means for long-distance communication, and having multiple transcontinental railroads is a mark of national pride, but I'm not even sure if the Panama Canal was dug, as it was never brought up once in the story. And that is the world our narrator, Hodge Backmaker, is from. Hodge is telling the reader his life story, and he reels you in immediately with the opening line of Bring the Jubilee.
Although I am writing this in the year 1877, I was not born until 1921. Neither the dates nor the tenses are error. Let me explain.
In case it wasn't clear, Hodge's last name, Backmaker, foreshadows the changes to the past that are coming. We follow Hodge's life from 1931 to 1952. An intellectually curious person, Hodge becomes disillusioned with being a farmer in rural New York, so at 17 he travels to New York City in the hopes he could somehow get accepted at college despite barely having any formal education. After being beaten and robbed on his first night, Hodge finds himself working at a bookstore which is connected to a terrorist organization called the Grand Army, which seeks to make the once defeated United States great again.
They're populists. They don't like the United States being a fifth-rate country. They think prosperity's got to come from the poor upward, not from the rich downward. Maybe they get a little rough with Whigs or Confederate agents once in a while, but you can't make bacon out of a live hog. Chase the foreigners out. Teach their agents a lesson. Build up the country again.
For 6 years, Hodge worked at the bookstore, mirroring the author's own time in Chicago managing one. When not working, he reads whatever books he can find, becoming a self-taught scholar, especially in history. And yet, Hodge is not satisfied to spend his life at the bookstore and still dreams of getting a higher education. This becomes an imperative when he gets caught up in a Grand Army counterfeit scheme that leaves several Confederate spies dead. Hodge's attempts to change his fate soon bear fruit when he is contacted by the Fellows of Hagershaven, a cooperative, almost utopian society of scholars who exist in rural Pennsylvania. Founded by a former Confederate major who moved to the region after seeing it during the Battle of Gettysburg, his descendants later become patrons of American professors who are disillusioned with the United States education system. Hodge takes them up on their offer to join, and while there becomes one of the foremost historians on the War of Southern Independence. He also has an off and on again relationship with the mentally disturbed but genius physicist Barbara Hagerswell, and helps a Spanish noble girl, Catalina Caddy Garcia, overcome her traumatic experience of watching her parents get killed by highwaymen. Caddy elects to stay in Hagershaven and soon marries Hodge. Despite finding love in a place where he can pursue his scholarship in peace, Hodge is unhappy. He struggles with the fact that no matter how much research he does, he can never know with any certainty what happened in the past. But then his old flame, Barbara, comes to the rescue. She has managed to develop a time machine and thinks it's the perfect tool for Hodge. Despite warnings from Caddy not to take shortcuts, Hodge elects to use it, unable to pass up being able to witness historical events firsthand. Thus, he decides to visit the Battle of Gettysburg and observe it with his own eyes. So, Hodge travels back in time to 1863, where he plans to witness the key turning point of the battle, the Confederate occupation of Little Round Top. But Hodge is careless, and the Confederate soldiers meant to occupy the hill find his hiding spot. They question him, but Hodge, not wanting to change history, stays silent. The soldiers interpret his silence to mean there are American soldiers waiting on the hill to ambush them, and in their panic they retreat, killing their commanding officer, a man named Herbert Hagerswells, founder of Hager's Havens and Barbara's ancestor. So Hodge watches in horror as the Battle of Gettysburg, a battle he dedicated his life to understanding, ends in an American victory. It's not clear how time travel works in Bring the Jubilee, but Hodge quickly discovers he is trapped in this alternate history. The twist being it is our timeline, which is a common trope today, but back in 1953, I'm not sure if anyone else did it before. Anywho, Hodge lives the rest of his life as a servant on a Pennsylvanian farm, known for his bizarre stories about an America that never existed. Okay, right off the bat, I have to point out some major implausibilities with the Bring the Jubilee's alternate history, because it's what I do. For example, a victory at Gettysburg was probably not enough for the South to win their rebellion. In fact, defeats at Shiloh, Antietam, and Vicksburg probably did more to hammer in the nails of the so-called Confederacy's coffin than the loss at Gettysburg did. Add in the skill of the U.S. military's own generals, like Grant and Sherman, combined with the effectiveness of the U.S. Navy's blockade of southern ports, and lack of foreign recognition of the rebels, and you can start to see why a victory in one battle near the end of the war would not save the slavers. In truth, Gettysburg was a gamble. They pinned winning the war on one big battle because they were about to lose it. But they lost, and yet the size of the battle, the personalities involved, and generations of lost cause historians ultimately made it seem more important than it really was. Still, even if the so-called Confederacy were victorious at Gettysburg, it wouldn't have stopped the Army of the Potomac from reforming and being reinforced, or the defenses in and around Washington, D.C. from holding against the Army of Northern Virginia, which would be far from its supply lines. And even if a victory at Gettysburg was enough to secure Southern independence, it doesn't solve the economic issues an independent Confederacy would face when the price of cotton dramatically falls in the 1880s, as new sources of cotton arise in different parts of the world, while soil depletion causes the Confederates' own crop to diminish. This is important because cotton was a major economic export of theirs, and they needed it for their economy. Granted, maybe they'd figure something out, but then again, maybe not. As counterfactual historian Roger L. Ransom, author of The Confederate States of America, What Might Have Been, once said in a 2012 interview I did with him, "Losing the Civil War is the best thing that ever happened to the South. Against their will, they were tied to one of the greatest engines of economic growth the world has ever seen, and although it took a while, they eventually profited from that growth. I have argued for years that the American South of today is a far better place to be, particularly for African Americans, than any plausible world where the South won the Civil War." Ultimately, though, all of that, everything I just said, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all, because Ward Moore was not trying to be plausible. In that same interview I did with Ransom, he also shared this with me. "The first time I remember seriously thinking about the consequences of a Southern victory in the Civil War was in 1953, when I read a novel by Ward Moore titled Bring the Jubilee. The story involves sending someone back in time who inadvertently changed the outcome at Gettysburg and led to a Confederate victory. Moore imagined a prosperous CSA that extended into Latin America, while the USA languished after their defeat. That outcome puzzled me, since in the 1950s, most of the antebellum South was hardly viewed as a monolithic economic and political force that could eventually rule all of South America. Now, Ransom was a super nice and interesting person to talk to, and his book is an excellent counterfactual history on the American Civil War, and I highly recommend you check it out. But the problem is, I think his interpretation of Bring the Jubilee is a tad shallow. The thing is, Ward Moore was politically left-wing, with experiences in the anti-war movement in World War I and in the labor movement of the 1930s. He even participated in the New Deal's Federal Writers Project. As a science fiction writer, he was known for his ecological and nuclear disaster fiction. Indeed, Moore is known for using speculative fiction as a way to bring politically and philosophically provocative ideas to readers who would otherwise never hear them. So, not exactly the background of someone you expect to write neo-Confederate fantasies, right? You also have to consider when Bring the Jubilee was written. In 1953, the civil rights movement in America was picking up steam. White segregationist Dixiecrats were abandoning the Democrats for the Republican Party, and McCarthyism was at its height. Knowing this, and you start to see parallels between the alternate 1950s Moore created and the 1950s of our timeline. For example, the United States in Bring the Jubilee is in reality a worse version of the South of our timelines 1953. Both are generally impoverished regions where many, whites and blacks both, lack the opportunities or rights that other Americans have access to. Meanwhile, conservative political elite maintains the status quo, often by riling up racial animosity or discrimination against recent immigrants. Occasionally, these elites are defeated by populists who promise certain reforms, but just as often as not, blame outsiders for all the problems. Meanwhile, the Confederacy of Bring the Jubilee is large and powerful, not because Moore thought they could become a superpower after independence, but because their economic and military might is meant to parallel post-World War II America. Their rivalry with the German Union is also a stand-in for America's rivalry with the Soviet Union. The CSA's alliance with Britain is a direct reference to the special relationship of America and the UK in our timeline. Even the Confederate conquest of Latin America, while absurd in its scope, is meant to remind the reader of America's own interventions in Central and South America. And do I need to remind anyone that xenophobia and discrimination against African Americans is still rampant today? To be frank, in Bring the Jubilee, Ward Moore is not praising a Confederacy that might have been. He is condemning the flaws and failures of our timeline's United States. Like Kevin Wilmot's mockumentary, CSA, The Confederate States of America, Bring the Jubilee is a satire, not a plausible counterfactual of an independent South. I mean, there are subtle jokes spread throughout the text that should give this away. Granted, they might mean more to a contemporary 1953 reader, but they are there. For example,
the average man asked what the United States needed colleges for anyway. Those who attended them only learned discontent and to question time-honored institutions. Constant scrutiny of the faculties, summary firing of all instructors suspected of abnormal ideas did not seem to improve the situation or raise the standards of teaching.
Actually, that joke still kind of works today, especially with all the scaremongering involving critical race theory, or if you mention that gays exist, that's grooming children. Which makes me think that if Moore was alive today, he'd be disappointed with the direction of the United States. Because Bring the Jubilee also acts as a warning for America to not miss out on an opportunity to be better. In the novel, Moore, through the protagonist now trapped in our timeline, praises what Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War where the U.S. attempted to reintegrate the South back into the Union while protecting the rights of recently freed slaves, could have accomplished.
That this world is a better place than the one into which I was born, and promises to grow still better seems true. The Negro is free. Black legislatures passed advanced laws in South Carolina, and black congressmen comport themselves with dignity in Washington.
And yet, Moore also foreshadows how America would ultimately abandon that project.
There are rumors of a deal between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats betraying the victory of the Civil War in return for the presidency. If this is true, my brave new world is not so brave.
Moore is pointing out that America was once on a better path, but it was abandoned for the oppression of white supremacy, and he's warning the reader that it can happen again. Now, to be fair, I can still see why some people could have missed this message. Moore's depiction of the Confederate Empire seems a little too grand, while his version of the Rump USA just seems a little too craptacular. You have to be careful with satire, because while absurdity is inherent in that form of storytelling, it is ridiculously easy to go too far. Thus, sometimes people miss the point you're trying to make, and instead the worst people think you're supporting them, while the people who could be your allies think you're one of the bad guys. But if people can read Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal and not eat children, then I think we can all read a book that's telling America to stop being racist. Look, in alternate history, paralleling historical events can sometimes just be lazy world building, but other times, like in Bring the Jubilee, it can be used to point out truths about our own timeline. I think Moore was trying to warn readers that while the so-called Confederacy never achieved their independence, there is still time for them to win the war. America could still become the Confederacy of Bring the Jubilee, because the racism in the South that led to Jim Crow and lynchings was not a unique feature to that region, and it could spread across all of America and remain in place well into the 21st century. Catherine Gallagher confirmed this in her book, Telling It Like It Wasn't. The novel takes full political advantage of the time travel plot, emphasizing that contemporary America had once again reached a crossroads, a nexus, when it might either betray the goal of emancipation or finally realize it. The history-changing time travel plot is therefore used to release certain social dynamics from their particular coordinates in time and space, allowing us to see the similarities between the reader's present options and those of historical actors. The device reinforces the lesson that Hodge learned when mastering his historian's craft.
That the past is past becomes ever less important. Except for perspective, it might as well be the present or the future, or, if one can conceive it, a parallel time.
So I think Moore is asking us to be on guard against the racism, isolationism, xenophobia, anti-intellectualism, and conspiracy theories that are always bubbling beneath the surface of America. Because like Hodge, we might one day stand at a turning point in history, and our actions, or inaction, might bring the Jubilee as it were, or lead to a return to a much darker America for millions of its citizens. That is why I think Bring the Jubilee deserves its status as an alternate history masterpiece. And if you disagree with me, That's fine. But maybe I convince some of you at least to reconsider it, or else see the potential alternate history has to prepare people to make the right decision in the future. Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitchrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.